Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Crossroads, and I'd like to again welcome my guests from Canada. Welcome, Robert Klinck.
Thank you, Arnie. It's really good to see you again.
No worries. Pleased to have you, Robert. And Wallace Klinck. Welcome, Wallace.
Absolutely. It's very nice to see you, Arnie. I understand that we could make a foray into some rather obscure historical things today.
That's the hope, Robert. That's the hope, Wally. Sorry, yeah. Okay, and that's exactly where we're going. So let's go and have a look. I'll cut across to a search I've done on the East India Company in Wikipedia, founded in 1600. And if you do a search on the Dutch East India Company, or the Spanish or the French or whatever, Austrian, you'll find that it was actually at that time the establishment of limited, I'll use these words, they may not be specifically correct, but you'll get my idea, a limited liability company where people bought shares into the company. And so you had the potential where, say, the Dutch East India Company, the shareholders, principal shareholders who bought into the different ventures that they were attempting to exploit, could be the same people in England or in Spain or in France or in Austria as the principal shareholders. And it really is important when we start painting this picture of, if you like, the coming together of shareholders of this whole share market and the establishment of it, and international conglomerations which were actually over and above government, over and above nations. And in particular, I just want to touch on one historical point, and I'm going to cut across to this website, and it's in regard to William III of England, William of Orange. William of Orange was invited, he was invited by merchants to come to England and to take over the throne. Now, as I understand it, the then King of England was still on the throne, and he had an army, and when William went to England, he actually brought an army with him, and William landed, and they took over, I believe it was Exeter, and then the king, I believe it was James, please understand if I'm incorrect, that's fine, I'm not a historian, but James chose not to actually fight with William, but rather he was captured by William and then allowed to flee to France. And of course, one of the strategic reasons why William of Orange came, apart from being invited by merchants, was to align with Britain, align with England against France. So the intrigue is particularly interesting, because you start placing these facts together and you think, hang on, if William was there and he was invited over by merchants, which in my mind is a treasonous act to take over the crown, a treasonous act by merchants, and yet he was successful without a battle, the Great Revolution, and of course then the king goes to France, and yet the purpose, the justification for William coming over, from his perspective, was to actually resist the influence of Louis XIV, I think it was. So there's all this cross-meshing of history. And of course, if you don't actually go to reliable sources, you get a significantly slanted view on what's actually going on. So we're attempting to understand some of these things, and I'm just going to touch on one more image here, and this is actually, hopefully my audio goes through. This is one of the regents of the Dutch East India Company, VOC. I think there's a Dutch words for it, but these are the regents, and the depiction, the illustration, the painting there is of the globe and their different atlases that they had access to, and they were, if you like, controlling the spice trade and other things right around the globe. This is absolutely incredible when you think about it. These regents here came together. I believe there was actually a group of 17 merchants who came together, and these were the leaders of those merchants, and they set about pursuing policy to exploit not only spices but other forms of trade, silk and things like that. And in amongst it, these regents of the Dutch East India Company had the ability to, they had about 125 ships. They had a standing army. Hello, this is a company here. They had a standing army, and they also minted their own coin. They minted their own coin. Fascinating part of history. Once you start piecing this together, you realise that there were these different pockets of East India companies around the world. Whether they were the same shareholders or not, I can't tell. I don't know. But the fact is that the shareholding system came into being. I'll just get cut across to another image. This is actually a picture, a painting illustration of the share market in Holland around that time. And I found these in a museum in Holland. I actually do have a link. I'll place the link on the when I post these videos up. I'll place the link there so that you can do your own research and have a look at this period of time around the 1600s going through to 1700. It really is a fascinating time of power being exerted around the globe by mega corporations over and above government. Now, bearing this in mind, this is really the, if you like, the groundwork of when William went to England. William of Origin went to England with Mary, and they were co-regents. When Mary died, 1694, that same year was the establishment of the Bank of England. The establishment of the Bank of England, again by merchants. Merchants were invited in to establish the bank, and it was based on the same model of Central Bank of Holland. It was based on it. I picked that up from a book by Kerry Bolton that I just happened to browse through yesterday. So these things are painting a picture of these mega corporations and establishment of central banks, and it goes back at least 400 years. So it really is an eye-opener when we consider in our today's circumstances of the influence of these mega corporations over governments. They really are only bit players. Our governments are only bit players, and of course when we consider the ramifications of the lockdown coming from the United Nations, coming from the World Health Organization, the Great Reset, this current lockstep lockdown, and of course the only option being pursued is a vaccine, and of course the mega billions that will be made by selling hundreds of millions, thousands of millions of vaccines around the world. At the same time as all this is going on, Bill Gates is buying up as much farmland as he can get his hands on in the United States. And I find this really just a frenzy of gathering of assets in order to make massive financial exploitation. It really is quite an insidious type of thing when you start piecing the picture together of what's happened with finance, what's happened with corporations over and above governments these last 400 years. Your thoughts, please, Wally Klinck.
Well, you say over and above governments. As a matter of fact, I think it might be correct to say that they are forming a government above government. I think, are you there, Arnie?
Yeah, I am, Wally. I'm listening. Go on.
Yeah, they form a government that straddles the world above existing elected governments.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, they are the true makers and shakers of the world. And it would seem to be that they have a coordinated policy. They probably are not in extreme competition with each other, but rather in extreme collaboration. It would seem to be that the end of this is some kind of a universal political regime which gives them the ability to put out their tentacles to any place in the world in order to affect policies that they want to affect. So it would seem to me that we're living. I mean, the Prime Minister of Great Britain long ago said that the world is ruled by very different people in a book he wrote. It was a fiction called Coningsby, but nevertheless, he brought out the concept of the world being ruled by, I think it was 200 or 300 people behind the scenes that were not seen. So there's something that seems to have been transpiring through the course of history that is directed and aimed towards some kind of policy, a grand centralizing policy, an accumulating policy whereby wealth is gradually gravitated toward the center. And you see, if you remember, Major Douglas, the social credit founder, way back at the beginning of the last century, just at the end of the war, First World War, he wrote an essay called The Delusion of Superproduction. And he brought out that there was a defect in the price system, and that this defect was a working out of policy. And he said that if the financial system and the price system were not corrected so that it would give a neutral representation of what is going on in the world, that the outlook for humanity was very, very disturbing. And you see, it was to work towards a centralization of power and wealth. Now, we see now, with the march of technology, displacing labor in the incredible way that it has, and the obvious difficulty in keeping people working because they're not needed as they were once, is forcing the policymakers to drop their full employment policy as it has existed. And they're having to look at the world in a different way, and in a way that requires different policy than has been followed in the past. We've managed to maintain some kind of a program of employment, whether to waste or war. We have managed to keep people more or less occupied in gainful employment, even if it was war. Whereas today, that possibility seems to be working itself to a fundamental end because of the march of the incredible fundamental march of technology, which has brought about the need for a new policy. And I think we're being forced now to that stage in history where we are entering into a crisis that can no longer be dealt with in the old ways. And so that's why they're talking about a reset. And our own Prime Minister was referring to a public assembly about this. Gives us an opportunity, a magnificent opportunity to experiment with new types of economies. So you see, we've reached a point where things are definitely calling for a change in policy. And the change in policy that they have in mind, obviously, is one of increased centralization of political power, an increasingly dominated and administered, bureaucratized world, one that is moving away from private enterprise and competition and that sort of thing, and will be involving a very heavy level of state involvement and interference in the lives of the people.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that, Wally. That's you've certainly opened up some thinking on that, and of course, state involvement. What the Chinese call social credit, I call it social discredit, of course, which is the surveillance state, and the ramifications of having them participate in every part of your life. Your thoughts, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, it's issue of there being an economic power sort of outside of the political power has been around for a very long time. I would say probably a lot longer than 400 years that you mentioned, Arnie, because we constantly discover that there has been trade from one remote part of the world to another, going back thousands of years. It's really quite a remarkable thing, and you wonder how in the world the whole business was organized. And then they came in with these trading companies, the Dutch and the English and a number of others, and well, they they operated quite apart from what was recognized as governmental power. Although the history of Europe is presented in terms of governmental power. I was just recently reading a history of the origins of the First World War, and it was all about how this Tsar wrote to that Kaiser, and the British monarch responded, and there were all these negotiations. But something more is always going on behind this, because there is an international commercial world, an industrial world, that has tremendous influence on the political structure. Shortly after the First World War, there was a German financier industrialist named Walter Rathenau. He actually ended up being assassinated, but he made this statement. He said that Europe is run by 300 persons, not Germany and France and all. Europe is run, and he said they all know each other, and they elect. Not only that, but they are a generational thing, because he said they elect their successors from their entourage. So this is a level of government that virtually nobody is aware of, because government to most people are the bodies that get elected and appear to be running things. But behind this, Walter Rathenau said, Europe is being run by this body of 300 people. Well, it would be very interesting for the public to have these people identified, but obviously Rathenau was talking about a sort of occult organization, an organization that he understood people didn't realize existed. So it's quite a remarkable thing, and it's quite certain that there has been no change in this situation, because people haven't even been aware of its existence. So subsequent to whatever existed at the time of the First World War, and we know that in every war, the First World War, the Second World War, and every other war, there are commercial interests that are involved in supporting both sides. You will find that, for example, the Rockefellers provided the technology to the Nazis in the Second World War that allowed them to produce fuel for their war machine from coal. So, and also there have been issues of, ball bearings that are essential to industry that couldn't be obtained by the Germans. They had to be obtained from some other country, and they were so that the war could actually be prosecuted. But a lot of this stuff came out after the Second World War, and it turned out that really constituted treason, because these commercial interests that people just aren't aware of were supporting the enemy in time of war. And so there's as I say, there's a super government, a government above what we normally identify as being government, and they seem to be all powerful compared to these politicians who I guess are just front men who distract people from the real power behind the scenes and protect in that way the people who are actually running things. I mean, in the East India Company, which is the British East India Company, you know, it wasn't Britain that conquered India. It was the British East India Company. They had a private army. They had a mercenary army, and they went in. A fellow named Clive defeated these Indian rulers, and as a result of that, the East India Company took over control of that immense country, you know, the Indian subcontinent. Subsequently, the British government seemed to have got involved more, but that might have been just for appearance sake, and very likely that British East India Company was operating behind the scenes the whole time. And so this is a situation that is rather concerning, because we're not aware of this influence particularly. I guess the modern equivalent would be something like Facebook or Google. These are companies that are operating apparently independently of government, and in many respects, they are completely dominating government. So this commercial power has to be borne in mind if we're going to have a realistic appreciation of how the world actually operates. And certainly attention should be paid to this.
Thank you for that, Robert. I want to actually cut across to a book that I'm aware of, and I've managed to locate it here at amazon.com.au. It's called Debt, the First 5,000 Years by David Graeber. And I think that in itself is an important resource, because what it does is it paints the picture that the actual goings on of the financial system of commerce and trade, and most importantly, debt as an instrument of power. David Graeber has made the point of actually recording that, going back 5,000 years. So he's done an excellent job of giving us at least information of how the system's been going on, how it's been working. So while I talked about or mentioned the last 400 years with the East India companies, the Dutch, the French, the Spanish, the Austrian, the English, all these different, perhaps even the Portuguese, these East India companies may have actually been acting in some form of concert, but at the same time maintaining enough rivalry to optimize profit for the principal shareholders. So to me this is important, because I've seen the same thing in my own working experience. You mentioned Rockefeller and that before, Robert, and my own experience, as I understand it, is that there were anti-monopoly laws passed in the United States, and Rockefeller had to actually disgorge himself from the dominance of one giant company, and so he formed subsidiaries. I call them subsidiaries, maybe the incorrect descriptor, but Standard Oil was part of the Rockefeller empire, and I worked for a company called Mobil, which was essentially the outworking of that name Standard Oil. But SO, Standard Oil, also became Esso or Exxon. And so you had Mobil and you had Exxon. And then you look at it and you think, hang on, what's the other name of an oil company? And it's called Caltex, California, Texas Oil. And then you might have Texaco. And of course there are many, many other names. And I'm not talking about Dutch Shell. I'm talking about just the main or the big players that Rockefeller had influence over. Now, of course, those companies are now forming back into a giant company. It was called ExxonMobil, but really, in a sense, Exxon is the dominant player in that amalgam of companies. So they come apart, but then they come together. But at the same time, Rockefeller was also involved in the big pharma. He was involved in chemicals and drugs and the development of the whole medical industry. And if you understand that, you realise that, hang on a sec, if you control, as I said the other week, if you control universities, especially medical universities, you train doctors to use the products that you want to market or sell. That's what it's about. And of course, to me, the issue of health is that, well, you've got to have a variety. You've got to have a variety of input, a variety of possible solutions to any particular problem. Nutrition may be part of it, vitamin therapy, herbs, even aromatherapy or naturopathy, other forms of consideration in your management of your health. But general practice, I call it general practice, which is the title they'd call themselves, is that you will do this whole thing through the drug industry. And so if you have these symptoms, it's given a label, those particular symptoms, that's the label, and on the basis of that label, you take this particular product or a range of these products which suit those symptoms. And so you mask the symptoms, You don't actually cure the disease. And it's a never-ending cycle of, you've always got people asking to mask the symptoms. They don't realise that, the doctor's curing me. No, he's not. He's masking the symptoms. If you want to cure disease, you've got to look at the root cause of what causes your dis-ease. What causes your dis-ease? Is it poor nutrition? Is it a smoggy environment? Is it stress? Is it poor sleeping patterns? Is it the latest consideration is magnetic fields, EMFs. Are you actually receiving more than your due share of electromagnetic fields? Are they actually having an influence on your metabolism that's causing dis-ease? All these are considerations into how you manage health. And if you've only got one option presented, of course, then your health can be manage the symptoms, but not necessarily address the disease, not go to the root problem, and it becomes part of a greater marketing strategy. So this picture, which I brought up, this picture of these regents of Dutch East India and the globe and the atlas, these merchants covering the world, I think it really is important to consider this image, that they were so proud of what they did, they were actually recording it for posterity. This is who we are. And of course, those merchants that are in that image cover, I think it's about 70 years across the 1600s. They were the chief regent for that period of time. So they're saying, yes, we are. This is us. We're in charge. And this goes across 70 years. And there's the world. There's the charts. And of course, you've got this whole thing about the map making. I forget the word for it, but the actual mapping of the world and how important that was in the development of understanding and the release of information into the, if you like, the world of the greater community. Your thoughts, please, Wallace Klinck.
Well, the great tragedy is that a lot of people, including conservatives, stand for what they think is a policy, but there is a policy that supersedes or exists above and beyond what they're thinking. I think a lot of conservatives think that they stand for, free enterprise, free entry, exit from the market, and that is basically what they want to promote because that's what they believe in. Quite rightly from that standpoint. But the problem is they do not understand that their free economy is controlled at a higher level and does not exist in the benign and innocent or neutral fashion that they would conceive it to be operating in. I mean, I just saw a debate between our so-called finance minister and Pierre Polyev, who's an MP, who's been quite critical of the Trudeau Liberal government. And they both taking a strong position, defending their policies or preferred policies. And I think that Mr. Polyev is really, I think, a decent and honest and intelligent man. I'm not at all convinced that the Prime Minister, the Finance Minister that we have in Canada is informed at all about that sort of thing. By the way, you might be interested that this was all in Parliament, the question period, and Pierre Polyev was trying to elicit an answer from the Finance Minister. She was asked how much money had been spent on these measures they've taken allegedly to alleviate the problems associated with COVID and the economy. And she was unbelievably uncandid about the whole thing. She just didn't seem to want to give an answer. And he was burrowing in, asking her over and over again just to answer a simple question. You couldn't get it out of her. And guess what? This was being carried in Facebook. And all of a sudden, a name familiar to some of us, Dr. Oliver Haydorn, came in and had his 2 cents to say about our finance minister. I was quite pleased. I think he did a good job. Anyway, so that's it. But the thing of it is, if something of a large nature is engaged in as a genuine service to humanity, it would be hard to criticize it. It might even deserve praise. But when the economy is run primarily to seek markets by less than honorable means and representation, and it is used in order to acquire economic power, which allows it to have political clout or power, then it's being perverted and diverted from its proper function as a genuine economic entity. And I think from our discussion today and from many, many other discussions and from many books that have been written and many studies that have been done, it is very obvious that economics today is not simply a question of trying to produce a better product and competing with the consumers for the purchase of it. It is being done to further policy. And you can see that quite a number of important executives in large companies today, you would think almost, you would wonder what they're doing there from a legitimate standpoint, because they're actually collaborating with internationalist forces, internationalist Marxist forces, and not standing for the interests of their shareholders. They've got some kind of another agenda. And that is a very strange thing. And you would be accused of being a conspiracy theorist to bring anything like that up. But here you have very powerful people like the Prime Minister of England and like Walter Rathenau and people like that literally exposing it. Exposing the drive toward centralization of world power. I mean, a conspiracy to the extent that they make statements which betray their intentions. I guess that is not total conspiracy, but they're assuming that the public doesn't understand these things, and that's a perfectly rational and correct assumption. Most people have no idea of what goes on in the highest realm of international politics or scheming, if you want, and economics. The economics is being used primarily as an instrument to gain power of a political nature, an ideological nature. I don't think that these people are primarily interested in the economic aspect, except in as much as that gives them power to influence the world.
Yeah.
And I think that's their primary, they're sort of a cognoscenti, a specialized, all-knowing class who have plans for the world.
Thank you for that, Wally. Yeah, thank you for that. I just want to touch on something that's happening actually right now in Australia. Western Australia is going through an election cycle. They're due to have an election in about 6 weeks' time, 6 weeks from tomorrow, I believe. And the leader of the opposition was placed in an embarrassing situation. One of the potential candidates for an electorate has stood up and said is challenging the COVID scenario, is actually arguing against the validity of COVID as an identifiable disease, and also the circumstances that were actually in Wuhan in China at the time. And the leader of the opposition has immediately called for her withdrawal from candidacy, immediately called for it, and he has prostrated himself in front of the media to say that he totally endorses all government policy and the chief health officer, etc., etc., etc. He couldn't have grovelled more. And so what he's doing is he's actually, as you say, he's the power over and above. We've just lost Robert there. The power over and above government is actually dominating the situation, and the leader of the opposition going into an election cycle, you'd think that he would want to present himself as a viable alternative, and he won't differentiate, so the policy is still being adhered to. And that to me is absolutely incredible, that the policy won't deviate, and they have this golden opportunity to actually say something different and set themselves apart. And so I think they're playing a dead rubber. Honestly do. I think the leader of the opposition in Western Australia is playing a dead rubber. He's not put his heart and soul into this election to actually win it, but actually to align himself with existing policies, but just saying he can manage those same policies better, which of course is no difference whatsoever. So he's prostrating himself towards the powers that actually be. And I think you need to actually identify that and be clear about that, Western Australia, and consider it in the election cycle coming up. Your thoughts, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, I seem to have been disconnected there, so I might not be in the thread of the discussion, but I was just going to, we were talking about how these sort of mystical, spectral financial and corporate personalities have seemed to be running things from behind the scenes. And isn't it remarkable that in the midst of all this COVID business, which is being translated to us through national and provincial or state governments, all of a sudden, the person who comes out and is sort of dictating the policy. I mean, we've had people like Bill Gates, and he is certainly a big international corporate player. And for some reason, he is telling the medical profession of the world what it should be doing with regard to vaccination and so on. But suddenly we have this fellow, Klaus Schwab, coming out. And who had heard of Klaus Schwab before the COVID crisis? And he's come out, and he is the one who has decided that this is a great opportunity for what he calls a great reset of all the institutions of society, apparently. So he's one of these mysterious characters who has emerged from the shadows and suddenly is overriding, apparently, all the elected political officials in the world. He's not elected. He's just some guy who wrote a book. But all the politicians are paying attention to him. All the politicians have adopted his formula for where we ought to be heading, and that is build back better. From country to country, all the politicians have adopted this slogan, and it originates in Klaus Schwab's concept of a great reset. So I think this is just another illustration of how what we consider to be the powers in the world are not the real powers. There's this corporate financial group in the background who are actually telling the politicians what they ought to do. I remember back in the 1970s, I was working in the House of Commons in Canada, and I was astonished when a woman who had been the Minister of Health quit that job or lost that job, and she immediately became a lobbyist for the pharmaceutical companies. That's a conflict of interest. I don't think there was really any period of waiting before she assumed that role. And that was a wake up for me, because I realized that this person who had been the Minister of Health seemed to be greatly influenced by the pharmaceutical industry. It didn't make much sense, but certainly we see this circulating of people into and out of the political domain and into the industrial domain. It's such a common thing now that the concept of conflict of interest doesn't seem to exist anymore. And you really get the impression that the politicians are minor players in this. Perhaps all they do is take orders from the corporate world. It certainly looks that way, because the corporate world seems to be able to do whatever it wants. And the politicians basically conform or sit in silence, allowing this to go on. So this is a situation we have. I also had an experience where I was visited by a colonel in the Canadian Army. And I was kind of a naive fellow. I was making conversation, and I just said, you know, I've heard some people say that the Vietnam War was just an opportunity for arms manufacturers to make a lot of money. And this fellow looked at me as though I was an idiot and said, well, what did you think it was all about? This is the colonel in the Canadian Army. That was another eye-opener for me. It was so frank and so blunt, treating me as if I was a hopelessly naive person. Of course, that's what the starting of wars is all about, is to put a lot of money in certain people's pockets. So this is the situation we have, and over top of the whole thing, we have this financial power. And these are people who are creating out of nothing the money whereby people are able to do things. It's a licensing system. It's a licensing system on human initiative. And it's a most extraordinary thing. Why should they have the control over this money? I heard a fellow the other day on the radio, say that these little subsidies that are being given to people to tide them over through this COVID crisis, he said, why is this being regarded as the government's money? This is the people's money. They should just have it. And it's true. The people have done all the creativity and created the economy through their efforts and through their ingenuity, and yet the money that controls it all is being manufactured by this elite. Well, we should regard it as the people's money, and I think this COVID crisis is actually a great opportunity to make that point, that it's time for the control that this creation of money gives to a tiny element in society to be ended. And principles must be established on which this power of money can actually be transferred to the population. It's long overdue, and this is where we should really be concentrating our efforts now. Because, yes, Klaus Schwab is right. There is an opportunity for a great reset, but let's hope it's not the reset he has in mind, that it actually turns into a reset where we head in the direction of decentralization of power and the liberation of personal initiative, rather than everybody being controlled and crushed by this international global drive for power.
Thank you for that, Robert. I'm reminded of a paper that Clifford Hugh Douglas gave to, I believe it was a Melbourne audience, and it's actually going to be in print at the same time as this video is posted up. And the monopolistic idea, I think, is what it's called. And that paper is very important because it illustrates to you, Douglas shows you, that the actual, if you like, the ebb and flow of finance, the actual whole circuit that finance operates in, is not the same circuit as the economy, but rather they're acting next to each other, and they're not necessarily acting in unison, but rather the financial orbit can expand or contract to suit its economic purpose, to suit its policy direction. They can release finance. Think about the First or the Second World War. Huge amounts of new credits were released in order to execute the war. And then, of course, immediately the war was completed, the surrenders was achieved, the finance was contracted in order to not make it obvious that you had this entire industrial base that could produce so much. You could export it in the form of jeeps and tanks and aeroplanes and bombs and personal clothes and food and everything else. You could export it all to the Pacific or to Europe, wherever the theatre of war was, and still the standard of living in the home nations was improving. It really was a sleight of hand that the contraction was immediately after the war, to show you that these things weren't actually apparent, because everyone was so relieved that it was the end of the war. But it is to me so vivid and so clear in my mind that there are two systems here. One is the financial system. When I show you the merchants of Dutch East India, the regents, they minted their own coin. The establishment of the Bank of England was a mirror copy of the same central bank model in Holland. And it continued on that same central bank model was repeated again in America, in Australia, in every other nation, this central bank model. And so these, if you like, this elite that operates over and above everything, you've got government, then you've got the elites of industry, and then over and above that again is the elites within central banking. And that's the illustration that I'm actually painting. And on our website, we actually have an illustration of this very model, and it came out of the Social Creditor, and I'll see if I can find it while I've got Wally up for his final comments and thoughts. Please, Wally.
Well, I think we can summarize the situation very briefly by saying that governments do not govern. Governments are governed, and they're governed by faceless people, often faceless people, behind the scenes, who exercise their influence and pressure through suasion that is buttressed by bribes and considerations that are given to the politicians. Politicians are not representing the people. Politicians are representing the powers that rule this world. And that is a very, very inverse relationship to what should be. We have elected these people to represent our interests, and we should be insisting that they represent our interests, and that we will not be ruled by faceless, nameless people behind the scenes. We want openness, transparency. We want candid behavior on the part of the politicians, and we want them to deal with our lives and our conditions and our problems and our successes on that level. And they had better remember that they are chosen by us and they should be representing us and nobody else. That's the way it is. And I think that you can these people who would like to remain essentially nameless, they sometimes come out, but basically they would not want to be held responsible for any of the less favorable things that happen to our society, and so they often remain in the background and not highly visible people. And I'm always suspicious of people who have, especially people who seem to be working or have agents working to reduce our ability to communicate freely with each other, censorship of any kind. When somebody wants to censor you, you'd have to be pretty naive to think that they're not doing it for some self-interest. Why would anybody want to censor anyone else? In other words, to inhibit the flow of knowledge, understanding. There could be no other reason than that they must feel that the population is very, very dull and they're easily taken advantage of, and that's what they want to do, to take advantage of them. And if you start talking in a way that exposes them, they become quite menacing and start to agitate for legislation to limit. After all, there must be some limits on expression of opinion. And it's a very, it's kind of an insidious sort of thing because it has a certain amount of credibility to it on the surface. But basically, the only thing that, the truth will out. And the truth must out, because only in truth can you eventually end up dealing with your circumstances in life on a successful basis. If you try and approach things from a non-scientific and on a dishonest way, there will be consequences, and those consequences are not going to be good for the general social weal or well-being. It's a sad state when society falls into that type of mode where dishonesty and threats and bribery and extortion actually affect policy through influence, intimidating or attracting people who are representatives so that they can feather their own nest or avoid some unpleasant consequences. This is no way for any kind of a civilized situation or civilization to behave itself. And it's not allowing us to reach our potential, our height of civilization.
Thank you for that, Wally. That's very well lucidly put. I want to cut across before I give you the floor, Robert. Just cut across to this illustration. It was done in 1937. The New Age, which was a social credit journal, and it depicts the actual strata of world government, if you like, and of course central up here is high finance. But interesting that you've got the world's press and the pulpit. The pulpit. These are instruments of oppression. Moral repression, legal repression, the world courts, and of course central banks, which is financial repression, so they can actually punish any government that's recalcitrant through the power of these central banks. Your thoughts and closing comments, please, Robert Klinck.
Yeah, well, what we've said, I think, this evening for us and morning for you, Arnie, on the other side of the world, is proof that our notions of democracy are fundamentally empty and meaningless, because whereas we have been taught that our political institutions are where the power lies, these are just facades. They're fronts for another power that lies behind. And even in our democracies, which all have been conformed to this idea of parties, where you have 2 or 3 parties maybe, and you have a governing party and you have an opposition party. This is the British parliamentary tradition. These parties, nowadays, the opposition parties are actually more radical than the governmental parties. And the governmental parties are all pursuing these politically correct agendas. And when the opposition stands up to criticize them, as often as not, they're going to say they're not going far enough. But this is not the sentiment among the general population. The general population tends to be, I would think, primarily conservative. They don't want to see the world transformed. They're not involved in this Marxist dialectical thinking, which requires constant change. Change in itself is good. Well, why is it good? If you've achieved sound organizational principles and an economy that is working well, why in the world do you have to overthrow it and constantly have change? This is madness. But it's the Marxist, Leninist, Trotskyite concept of constant change, revolution, constant revolution, continuous revolution. That was the formula that as Trotsky expressed it. You cannot have any peace. You have to be in a constant state of turmoil and changing all the social relationships and the economic system and the political parties, at least, if not structure. Douglas, back in this Great Depression, was quite a turning point for civilization. That Great Depression of the 1930s, and in it, it was quite easy to draw attention to the insanity of the whole thing. They were destroying products. They were dumping fruit, letting it rot. They were pouring milk down the gutters. And at the same time, there were people going hungry. Well, it was fairly easy to draw attention to the inanity of this whole business. And that is when social credit became a world movement, because social credit was drawing attention to the problems with the financial system. And these problems were what lay behind all the trouble people were having then. So it was very interesting that in response to the social credit and the criticisms by other monetary reformers, but social credit was a big element in the monetary reform pressure of the time, we had politicians who were coming out, and oddly enough, they were attacking the banks. We had in Canada Mackenzie King. He came out and he was saying that the banks had an influence over society that was unhealthy. And in the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt made the same kind of criticism. Well, they were just responding to the understanding of the financial system that was being promoted by monetary reformers at the time. But Douglas looked at these specific criticisms that were apparently, really taking it to the financial institutions, and he said they were actually, if you looked at them, centralizing speeches, because the solution that was being proposed was always further centralization of power. And he said, when you are studying the policy proposals, you must always obviously look at where they're pointing. And if they're pointing to further centralization of power, they are where you don't want to go. So we can see that the centralization of power now is being consolidated on a global level. And we have just a bunch of puppets in the position of national leadership. So Douglas's warning back in the 1930s is being confirmed today. And under the conditions that have been imposed to fight this alleged COVID crisis, we are seeing the culmination of what has been a plan for centuries to create an international government, a government in which national interests would be superseded completely by an international cartel, an international bureaucracy, non-elected and not responsible. And we are on the precipice of this being consolidated in a form that will be almost impossible to reverse. It will be reversed because it's so contrary to the human spirit that eventually the project will fail. But if it is allowed to succeed as it seems to be succeeding now, there is going to be tremendous hardship for the population of the world for decades to come. So it really has to be resisted and reversed. We have to go to decentralization. And how are we going to do this? We have to do it through the financial system. It's the key to the whole thing. And the proposals for decentralization of the social credit monetary analysis are the ones that really provide for decentralization. A lot of monetary reformers just want to take the power away from the banks, the power to create money from the banks, and put it in the treasury departments. Well, what's that going to accomplish? It doesn't transfer power to the population. They're just as subject to arbitrary decisions coming from a centralized authority as they are under the banking monopoly. So this is not the solution. It might be an intermediate stage, but there has to be a proposal to distribute that power that exists in finance right down to the level of the individual citizen. And money being infinitely freeable, I guess they say, divisible, is the tool whereby this can be accomplished. Social credit proposals are the key to this reform. And let's give Klaus Schwab his great reset, but one that heads in the opposite direction to the one he envisages.
Thank you so much for that summary, Robert. It's a beautifully put. The power to actually be transferred from, if you like, that illustration of those merchants, those regents of the Dutch East India Company, transferred from merchants like that back to the people. So they're transferring it, and that really, if you think about it, when the vote, and the vote's really only 100 years old, not much more, for every man and woman in society, the vote is a transfer of political power to you and what you do with it. And of course, the idea of a national dividend, consumer price discount, is transferring that monetary vote to you in a similar fashion so that each gets their equal share. And what they do with it, how they use their monetary vote is up to them. But their entitlement to that bit of power is not to come from government, but it's actually a gift. It's a gracious gift from the cultural inheritance. It's a gift from God. Thank you so much, Robert and Wallace Klinck, for today's forum. It's been beaut.
Thank you, Arnie. We never know where we're
Arnie.
going, but we transgress a certain amount of territory that is pretty fascinating.
No worries.